emphasize how crucial it is to mainstream journalism when it makes this claim to neutrality. It's one of the bedrocks to journalism's claims to legitimacy and special status in the country. Okay? This claim to neutrality is not unique only to journalism in the United States. What I want to play for you first, to put this in context, is a clip from one of the CNN evening shows with Eliot Spitzer. You remember Eliot Spitzer, yes? Former Attorney General of the state of New York, hard-charging political figure, elected governor of New York, and then decided to step down from governor of New York so he could spend more time with his family, yes? That's the political euphemism for being caught in a scandal. Eliot Spitzer, you might remember his scandal, was soliciting the services of women who are prostituted. So this is a crime, and Eliot Spitzer's political career was over. But when you are at your lowest of the low people, your life is over. Your career you have carefully built has been trashed by your own inability to exercise what we might call impulse control, yes? Don't worry, there's always television. There's always a resurrection in television, because television has no standards. You see what I'm trying to say here? Okay. His co-host in this is Kathleen Parker. She was fired last week, so, you know, things move quick in this world. But this is a clip from their CNN show. They are talking to the editor of Al Jazeera English. We've talked about Al Jazeera in the past. Al Jazeera Arabic is probably the most important television channel in the Arab world. It's based in the country of Qatar. It's funded in part by the government of Qatar. It's a very unusual kind of arrangement for a journalistic enterprise. But Al Jazeera has, over the last decade especially, emerged as a very important news source in the Middle East. Al Jazeera also launched an English language channel called Al Jazeera English. It's available on cable networks, although very few cable networks in the United States carry it. Very few cable systems. You cannot get Al Jazeera English on cable in Austin, but you can access it on the web, and it's got a lot of traffic on its website. Because Al Jazeera is in the Middle East, because it's often seen as reporting with a Middle Eastern perspective, there is much criticism of it in the United States for perhaps being biased, for not being neutral. And I want you to listen. This is a couple minutes of the editor of Al Jazeera English defending his channel. Okay. In case you're wondering, that editor is not native to the Arab world. Could you catch from his accent? He's British. And in fact, Al Jazeera, especially Al Jazeera English, a lot of its staff is drawn from the sort of BBC-trained English journalism. Anyway, all right, so Al Jazeera Arabic, Al Jazeera English. He's saying there's a distinction between them. But let's just think about Al Jazeera. It's a television network based in Qatar in the Middle East, in the Arab world, the heart of the Islamic world. How many of you believe that they're truly neutral? Do you believe that? I don't believe it for a second. Right? Come on. It's an Arab channel, yes? It's going to reflect the sort of general point of view of the Arab world, don't you think? Come on. Come on, you believe that we're pro-nothing, we're anti-nothing? Who believes that? I don't believe it for a minute, okay? I think it's a claim one can understand why he's making, but it's not a very compelling claim. Just like it wouldn't be a very compelling claim if an American editor from an American network came on and said, we're pro-nothing, we're anti-nothing. Do you believe that? Well, people in the U.S. are more likely to believe it about American networks, but why? If we don't believe it, if we can see how something like Al Jazeera might in fact reflect a worldview that is different than ours, that might lead to stories covered in ways that aren't covered in the U.S. or in other parts of the world, that makes sense to us. But if it makes sense to us about Al Jazeera, in which you have professional journalists, working, trained professionals, right? Why would we not see the same thing about our own media? It's a question to ask. It goes to this issue of neutrality. And if you remember at the first day of class, I said one of the things about claims to neutrality is that they're easiest to make when your claim to being neutral reinforces the dominant point of view, the conventional wisdom. If what you're saying reflects the dominant point of view, especially the point of view of the most powerful people and institutions in your society, if what you're saying is in line with that dominant point of view, it's easier to make the claim that it looks neutral because you're not pushing against anything, you're going with the flow. And when you're going with the flow, it's a lot easier to make that claim. Let me give you a few quotes that highlight this. Okay. My favorite one line, my favorite bumper sticker to make this point comes from Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn is a historian. I may have mentioned him earlier in the semester. He died last year. Most famous for his book, A People's History of the United States. Howard Zinn was a historian who challenged the conventional wisdom. He took U.S. history and scrutinized and interrogated and re-narrated U.S. history. And he later in his life wrote a kind of intellectual autobiography, a memoir of sorts. And this was the title of that book, You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. It's a lovely book if you're interested. You can't be neutral on a moving train. What does he mean by that? Well, imagine life as being on a train that is going somewhere. You're on a train. The society in which you live is a train and it's moving somewhere. And you're on that. And to claim to be neutral on a moving train, Howard Zinn is suggesting, is an illusion because the train's going somewhere. And if you pretend to be neutral, that is, if you don't try to affect the direction of that train, if you don't try to affect the speed of it, if you're just on that train and it's moving, Zinn is arguing you're not really neutral. You're moving with that train, that system, that society. So this is, I think, a pithy way to capture the idea that there is really, in human affairs, no way to be neutral. Because human affairs are always moving, and you're either moving with them or you're moving in resistance to them, and that's a choice you have to make. Here's another expression of this from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who many of you may know, a Nobel Prize winner, the South African religious leader who was at the center of the struggle of apartheid, became at one point kind of the symbol for the world of resistance to white supremacist rule in South Africa. And Tutu once said, if you're in a situation where an elephant is sitting on the tail of a mouse and you say, oh, no, no, I'm neutral, the mouse is not going to appreciate your neutrality. What Tutu's saying is very clear. There are disparities in power in the world. Like it or not, there are people, institutions, and societies with great power and those with less. And in conflicts between the powerful and the powerless, to claim to be neutral is not going to look so neutral to the people without power who are struggling. Okay? Let's move on. Paulo Freire, another important voice in, I think, the struggle to create a more just world. You may know Paulo Freire, especially if you've been in an education class. He was a Brazilian educator, worked in what is often called popular education, not just education within institutions like this, but education in the world among people. He challenged a lot of the conventional notions about how education should go forward. For instance, he challenged the idea that one person should stand up in front of a room of people and lecture to them as if that person had all the knowledge and the people in the room were nothing but empty vessels waiting to be filled up. He challenged that whole model of education. I guess that meant he challenged my life, but we'll leave that for now. Paulo Freire said, to do nothing about the conflict between the powerful and the powerless is not to remain neutral, it is to side with the powerful, stating that same sort of essential claim that Tutu is talking about. That there is power, there is disparity in power, And there are struggles because of that disparity. Okay? One last one. Miles Horton, someone I doubt very many of you have ever heard of, was also an educator in this popular education realm, in this case in the United States. Miles Horton founded something called the Highlander School, which was an important institution in the history of social justice organizing in the United States. A lot of the important leaders in the labor movement, the civil rights movement, trained at Highlander. Martin Luther King Jr. went through Highlander. Rosa Parks went through Highlander. Highlander did a lot of popular education training, organizing training, and was one of those institutions most people have never heard of, but was very important. Miles Horton, in a conversation he had with Paulo Freire, I take this from a book that was based on a long conversation between these two very important educators. He said, as soon as I started looking at the word neutral and what it meant, it became obvious to me there can be no such thing as neutrality. It's a code word for the existing system. It has nothing to do with anything but agreeing to what is and will always be. That's what neutrality is. Neutrality is just following the crowd. Neutrality is just being what the system asks us to be. Neutrality, in other words, he concludes, was an immoral act. So that's a very different perspective. In contemporary mainstream journalism, neutrality is put forward as the defining characteristic of being a professional journalist. But these others, who tend to be critics, suggest otherwise. Horton says it most clearly. Neutrality is immoral. That in this struggle, to remain neutral is an immoral act. Now, this is one of those questions, I'm not suggesting you accept the position of one of these writers or educators, or accept my position, but something to ponder, something to wrestle with. What does it mean to claim to be neutral? I'm going to leave it at that for now.